Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, protests, police, and hope for the future. George Floyd's life was snuffed out on the streets of Minneapolis. Ahmaud Arbery was gunned down on a Georgia road, and Breonna Taylor shot to death in her sleep. Millions have taken to the streets in multiracial worldwide protests, declaring that Black lives matter. Celebrity athletes, corporations, and ordinary Americans are demanding police reforms and systemic solutions to racism. And then last week, more trauma. Rayshard Brooks died with 2 bullets to the back. Against this bloody backdrop, African Americans gather today to commemorate Juneteenth, the day the last enslaved people on these shores were declared free. But as we look forward, is there real hope for the future? We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. They are Dr. Khalil Muhammad, professor of history, race, and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at Radcliffe. Rahsaan Hall, Director of Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. Dr. Cecil R. Webster, Jr., child psychiatrist and psychotherapist and lecturer in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. And Kenneth Shropshire, the Adidas Distinguished Professor of Global Sport and CEO of Global Sport Institute at Arizona State University. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Khalil, I'm starting with you. Right about now, many people are saying, is this a movement or a moment? I'd like to update that and say, is this symbolism or a structural change? And I want you to make meaning of where we are. There's a lot going on, and it seems to have come together in this very interesting kind of stew, which and with so much intensity that it's hard to quite know exactly what's happening. How do you make meaning of it?
Well, I certainly like and appreciate your distinction between symbolism and substance, because clearly a movement has been afoot for about a decade now. It hasn't always been embraced, and it most certainly had not been embraced by the large numbers of white protesters that we've seen in the streets for the past 3 weeks. So I want to make a distinction between the movement, which has never gone away. For people watching this broadcast, the civil rights movement wasn't one uninterrupted chain of local victories. There were many moments where months and sometimes years passed without significant progress. And they literally experienced 3 presidential administrations from Eisenhower to JFK to LBJ. So that being said, there's no question this is the largest racial justice, anti-racist movements in American history, given the scale and scope of the numbers of cities participating and the scale and scope and the range of whites participating, not just the young white folks we saw laying down I Can't Breathe and various die-ins during the Ferguson and Eric Garner days of 2014 and 2015. We're seeing really a cataclysmic shift in consciousness and participation for, I'd say, a generation of young Americans between 15 and 25. And some of their parents are joining them. These are happening in all white communities in predominantly white states. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think the pandemic logistically has provided an opportunity for people to take to the streets in ways that would not have been sustained otherwise. I also think that the president has run out of options with regard to his incompetence, his racism, his attack on democratic norms. Literally 120,000 Americans are dead in part because of the lack of success of his administration in dealing with the pandemic. That all being said, what we can anticipate remains to be seen based on how much substantive change takes place in civil society. I think legislators are going to go to work at the local level. We already see Congress moving, but a lot will depend on what happens in the private sector and the nonprofit sector. That's where a lot more action is for day-to-day microaggressions and racism, et cetera.
Well, which brings me to you, Kenneth Shropshire, because you've made the point that what we're seeing with athletes coming out being very clear about where they stand in this moment, black athletes I'm talking about, is really coming after a period of activism, that it just didn't happen. There's been some stuff going on before that led them to be very much in front of this particular moment in time.
Now, there certainly was a transition in 2014. Philando Castile, the Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin. I mean, those were motivators for athletes to become involved. The Minnesota Lynx, actually, women led the way, is usually the case in our community. Women led the way protesting as professional athletes. And then we saw at a bigger level, we saw LeBron James leading the Miami Heat then in their Trayvon protest, a great photo that was put out there through social media to bring attention to the issue. But this came after years of absence. This came after, we all got to watch The Last Dance, and we were reminded of a lot of things, including the absence of political activism in that era, that there was a commercial value to not being engaged in that kind of way, to be more like Jack Nicklaus or Arnold Palmer, any other athlete, and be apolitical, don't be racial. And that's clearly what the mode was until, much like Ali, the athletes were impacted directly. They understood that this could happen to them. It wasn't some world hunger issue. It wasn't some AIDS issue that may not have impacted everyone. It was an issue that everybody could feel. And with LeBron leading the way, really, athletes said, okay, we can step up. And then certainly with Cap kneeling, Colin Kaepernick stepping up, brought things to another level in terms of engagement and really in terms of amplifying, again, the sacrifice that could be made in this kind of moment.
So we've seen the young driver, NASCAR driver, the only black driver, step forward. I mean, we've seen some voices we haven't seen before. I was particularly interested in a young man named Emmanuel Ocho, I think is his last name. And he started a video series just speaking back to the moment called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. Let's take a look.
I live in an affluent neighborhood in Austin, Texas, and if I ever go to my mailbox and I see a white woman walking up to the mailbox, I consciously sit in my car because I don't want her to feel like I'm a threat. If I'm on an elevator with a white person, I try to hit the button first and get off the elevator first because I don't want them to perceive me as a threat, because I realize at any point in time, whiteness can be weaponized.
That's a pretty powerful statement. And again, just seeing it come from the world of sports is really powerful in terms of its impact and reach, because we know what that costs some black athletes. We also know, as you've said, Kenneth Shropshire, that this is a period of activism that was stirred by the Trayvon Martin and those tragic events not long ago. I want to turn to you, Cecil Webster, because new information just came out. It seems like every time I talk to you, there's a new study. Well, one just came out from census data that said, and you won't be surprised, that African Americans are extremely traumatized in the wake of George Floyd's killing, that the rates of anxiety and depression are going up. The next group, I just note, will be Asian Americans. We shouldn't be surprised by that either. But you've talked about how to navigate this and at the same time look at it as moving forward in a kind of positive way. Talk to me about how you do that, because it feels very heavy, and I don't know how we parse it to move forward.
Well, yeah, but it's a very difficult question. If I look back on the last couple of months, particularly in this last few weeks, and I think about the young black boys, for example, that I see in my clinic, and they have questions like, should I be afraid of the police? Do I need to be afraid of white people when I get older? Those are impossible questions to answer, particularly as a clinician, but also personally as a black man in America. There are lots of ways, for example, in the video, that people have been able to deal with this, but a lot of it has to do with accommodating the weaponization of whiteness and white fear in many ways. And those can be really tough lessons to teach young people. It's really dehumanizing in many ways. It can cause a lot of things like depression or anxiety or having to split off parts of ourselves as well. But if we look at it more in terms of a larger societal issue, we have to be more comfortable with being able to allow ourselves to embrace things like fear and conflict and discomfort if not only for white America, but for the safety of Black America and others. It's not surprising to hear that statistic, that questionnaire that was put out recently. There are some others that have recently come out as well that reflect that as well.
Rahsaan Hall, the cries have gone from no justice, no peace to defund the police, to dismantle the police, to police reforms. I mean, that's been a target now as people look toward how there can be some structural change. It's not clear that everybody understands what that structural change should look like. You are saying reforms are not going to get it at this point, that this is a moment that we need to be bigger and push forward harder.
Right. When you think about the murder of Eric Garner, a lot of people were saying, you know what, we need body cameras. Or the murder of Michael Brown, everybody was saying we need body cameras. But then you see Eric Garner get murdered on screen. You see Sandra Bland being pulled to the side of the road and taken in custody unjustly. And then there's video footage later that's shrouded in mystery around her death. Or you see the police body camera footage of a Tatiana Jefferson who was murdered in her home. And then more recently, you see George Floyd being murdered on video. And even though it wasn't body camera footage, that was a reform that was being pushed forward with the hopes that it would help hold police accountable. And that's why the conversation around police abolition and abolishing the police has had so much traction more recently. And, you know, it seems to be kind of a popular fad right now, but there have been people who have been advocating for abolition and defunding or divesting the police for half a century now. I remember reading a story of Bayard Rustin when he was involved in the mid to late 40s, involved in some protest movements going down to the South, and was incarcerated. And he and others started developing a civil rights advocacy platform that included divesting from police and dismantling the police structure. Angela Davis has been a long time advocate for police and prison abolition. And so when you think about the institution of policing itself and its roots in slavery and oppression and being a tool of white supremacy in this country, reforms aren't going to make it any better. And that's what people are coming to recognize. And that's why I appreciate Dr. Muhammad's point about the length and trajectory of a movement. You know, it's not like one day there was a bus boycott and then we had civil rights. You know, it's a long fought journey and struggle to lift up ideas and strategies and to begin to change the narrative of what could be possible. And that's what's happening now.
Just a point, a recent study just came out that 70% of the stops by Boston police are of African Americans, in case anybody questions. That's from the police's own data, just so we're clear about that. Yes.
And Black folks only make up 24% of the city of Boston's population. And the ACLU, we did a report back in 2014 that did a similar study. And back then, it was only 63% of the stops were of Black people. And so it's gone up. And we even have a Black commissioner.
Khalil Muhammad, you said in the civil rights movement, there was a cry for justice. And now this group, the people in the streets now, are demanding justice. What does that do to make things happen? Everything's flying around. They're changing Aunt Jemima. They're going to, rebrand all these other products, problematic products. Corporations are throwing money at programs because they want to make sure that we're heading in the right direction. There are all kinds of conversations going on in workspaces. What does the demand for justice mean in terms of making sure that this sticks and something really does change? Khalil?
Well, I think the most important ingredient can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think the most important ingredient for substantive change is people power. And people power is both what happens in the streets. It's also what happens when movement leaders go to the table to negotiate the change that is required. I think one of the things that's very important to lift up in this moment is the organization Movement for Black Lives is an umbrella organization representing at least 50 different organizations spread across the country, some of those organizations with multiple chapters. The really important part of this moment is to recognize that local movement leaders will continue to focus on local changes in their communities. How that transfers into the private sector and corporations is that local C-suite leaders, senior managers, and the handful of Black folks with any modicum of power within those organizations are going to have to look at the business model and decide, are we on the right side of the history or the wrong side of the history? How do we create a business model that promotes justice and egalitarianism? The banking sector, the financial industry, for its entire history, but most certainly over the last 50 years, has profited by pricing Blackness as a form of risk, which means access to capital for Black folks has been higher, which means that we've artificially inflated the value of white property and every other thing in white America. So that is the dismantling work that the private sector is going to have to take on if it is to sustain a different relationship to the Black community and to an agenda of racial justice.
So, Ken Shropshire, you've made clear that, where you stand is very different from where your children stand, and generational difference is impactful in this moment because you remain a skeptic steeped in that civil rights generation, but the post-civil rights generation believe they can make these changes happen. Why are you so convinced that these young people are making it are going across the finish line for the first time?
Well, I'm hopeful. I'm a hopeful. Let me say that. I think where they have to be careful, though, is on this symbolism piece. I mean, I know we spent a lot of time, for example, on the King holiday. I mean, that was a very important moment, but I can't tell you how much time, as I reflect back on it, we focused on that. Maybe we could have been focused on something else other than the symbolism of a Juneteenth holiday. The idea that companies are celebrating that they're able to give people a day off in this moment, I don't think that's not really the issue. I mean, that's not. Tell me that you are going to reform the police. Tell me that you are taking some steps to end mass incarceration. But the idea of we're going to give everybody a day off Juneteenth, and to me too, just personally, Juneteenth was kind of a more intimate, one of our top secret kind of things. And for it to become, the latest dance craze is really not the kind of progress that I'm looking for. But having said all that, I have confidence that there is forward movement, and to see, as Dr. Muhammad mentioned, kind of the racial masses from different parts of society coming together is a completely new day.
Cecil, you've said and made real clear that this is not a Black problem, this is a white problem. And we're in the transition of having these kinds of conversations and having the awakening of many, as we've said, young white people in this moment. But these are tough conversations, and
Absolutely.
Maybe I'm with Kenneth Shropshire. I'm waiting for people to lose interest, I guess. And what do you see that might support the continuation of effort?
It's a very good question. I wish I had a clear answer about that, but I think particularly this has been a discussion amongst many clinicians recently. Like, what's different about this moment? Why is it that young white Americans especially are being able to observe the sort of white supremacy and the sort of prioritization of whiteness in this country in a historical sense? It's, a lot of people have many ideas, but I think a part of it has been coronavirus, ironically, and the increased use of or penetrance of media. We don't have any distractions. Many people are at home. They might be furloughed. They might be unemployed. We're not vacationing in the ways that we used to. We are not burdened with the same amounts or the same types of work that we had been previously. Everybody has to pay attention. And when you couple that with undeniably really horrific things that one can see on Twitter, on Facebook, on their Instagram, on a video sent to a group chat, it becomes a really undeniable aspect of America's history. So I think as things become more and more undeniable, perhaps we have a shot. But yeah, you're right. This is Black people have not created this problem in America. And while we can certainly bring a lot of focus, attention, and understanding, this is my opinion, as well as some other scholars out there, that this will be something that white America will have to contend with. there's been this sort of creation of this other in this country, of a black threat, whatever that might be. And James Baldwin said it very well. I'll paraphrase what he said, but essentially that that has been an invention by white America, and it's going to be the responsibility of white America to understand why in order for us to have a shot. My hope is that white America will begin to understand why and pay closer attention to our history.
Now, Rahsaan, I know that nothing goes away right away, but it is striking that in the middle of all of these worldwide protests, we have this situation with Rayshard Brooks, asleep in a drive-through food line. And, 2 seconds later, he's dead, which is, if that is not the ultimate example of what we've been talking about and what people are protesting in the streets, I don't know what is. So is there one thing, Rahsaan, that you would point to right now that says to you that something else is going to happen beyond people being in the streets? Because when that stops, I don't know what happens next.
I've seen a lot of lawmakers being very responsive, reaching out to Black-led organizations, to civil rights advocacy groups, asking, what can we do? And seizing on this moment, right, in light of the coronavirus pandemic, the gross racial disparities and who is contracting and dying of this pandemic, the reality that the education gap will be exacerbated by the technological gap, the economic insecurity that Black businesses face. Many Black businesses will not come back from this. And you layer on top of that these very visceral reactions to police murdering Black people in ways that are unjustifiable. And I think this conversation, and Dr. Webster pointed it out, just like this is racism and white supremacy is white folks' issue to deal with. We've been burdened with it, and we have been fighting against it and fighting to dismantle it, but it's their work to do. And I think there is a reckoning that is happening. But what concerns me, though, is that we will be satisfied with being invited to the table and the talk of aspirational, altruistic notions of reform, when what is needed is deep structural transformation. That's why the conversation around police abolition, prison abolition, guaranteed income, guaranteed housing, like those have so much meaning now, because we understand that the system as it continues to function will never serve us, right? We can continue to reform policing, but for the amount of money that gets invested in policing, that's more money that's being taken away from services that we need in our community: mental health services, substance use disorder treatment services, having paid professionals respond to people who are experiencing homelessness, right? That's the service that we need that's based in our community, but reforms are never going to bring that about. And so as long as we keep pushing for those dramatic, deep structural changes and this reckoning around this nation's history with white supremacy, we'll see something different. Otherwise, we'll be back here in 5 years having the same conversation.
And in fact, Khalil, Microsoft got in a little bit of trouble. They hired a Black artist to do a mural for the moment to express their support of what was happening with the protesters in the street. But the memo said they wanted her to hurry up and do it while Black Lives Matter was relevant.
Yeah, well, again, so just not to be overly glib, if it took 400 years to get to this point, it's certainly going to take more than a couple of weeks with a series of statements and tweets and social media campaigns and hiring diversity consultants, et cetera, to come in and tell people how they've gotten it wrong. The truth is that white folks have been willfully in denial about the scale and scope of racism. Whole libraries are full of testimonies and scholarship around these issues. This is akin to being a climate change denier when it comes to systemic racism in America. And we have vocal Black people, from Candace Owens to this young guy, Coleman Hughes, and a whole litany going back to Thomas Sowell over the last 40 years of the same kind of anti-climate change denial in the Republican Party. So a lot of white folks in the middle, self-described moderates, liberals, the kind of folks that fueled Obama's own talking points about race, which were totally inadequate to the Black Lives Matter movement several years ago, we can't forget. Those are the folks that have shaped the dominant culture around what is acceptable. about how we talk about these issues. And so, yes, the five of us agree that this is real, but what's already been said here is white moderates, liberals, progressive centrists are going to have to decide that they don't want to be racism deniers any longer. And that's where the future holds great possibility.
Kenneth Shropshire, do you see white people saying they don't want to be racial deniers anymore, as Khalil has said? Are you seeing that?
Sure, we are seeing that, and as somebody alluded to, the statements that have been issued. I mean, I do a lot of work in the corporate space as well as in the sports space, and you are not in vogue if you did not issue a statement saying how you want us all to sing Kumbaya together. I mean, so there's a lot of, we are in a moment where you almost have to say something, either that or go attend the rally in Tulsa. So it's we will see. I mean, this is just a moment in time. And as I said, there's a lot of symbolic stuff going on. When the dust settles, we'll know if we are making progress.
Well, we got to leave it there. That's the end of our broadcast, the end of our show. I want to thank all my guests and thank you for joining us. Stay with us right now, though, as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter.